Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, your dinner plate and the planet's fate. What's the connection? Presented by Jason Clay. Jason is WWF's Senior Vice President for Markets. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, Jason. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. I just want to point out first that if you have a question and put it in the chat, we don't get to it, I promise I'll answer it later. So we'll just make sure that everybody's questions get answered. But today I want to talk about why and how WWF started to work on food about 25 years ago and what that journey has looked like. But first I want to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, and I think that's also important. I grew up on a farm. This was just before, or I guess right around my 4th birthday, and what I learned, I think, on that farm was how to work, how to think, how to solve problems without money, how to make decisions, and perhaps most important, how to observe. And it was a really great childhood. But that same tractor that you see there about 11 years later flipped over on my father and killed him in an accident. And at that point, at the age of 15, I had to take over running the farm. And suddenly being a farmer was a very different thing. There was a lot more responsibilities. I think I must have probably been one of the few ever accepted students at Harvard who had run a farm at the age of 15 and lived on less than $1 a day, both of which came to be very important in my subsequent life. I knew I didn't want to teach. I tried to teach a bit. I tried to work for the US Department of Agriculture, but ended up volunteering in a human rights organization and started doing surveys of refugees and famine victims, and came to find out 2 things. First of all, most were farmers, and so I had an instant rapport with them, but also they were mostly indigenous people or ethnic minorities that were in conflict with the countries where they lived. I got tired of being an expert in determining how many body bags we were going to need in refugee camps. So when the Grateful Dead offered to do a benefit for the rainforest, the group I was in accepted, and we ended up receiving about $500,000. And from that funding, I was able to begin to set up businesses to help indigenous groups around the world make their own money and hire their own lawyers and defend their own land rights rather than depending on outside institutions. One of the things I did was help set up a Brazil nut shelling cooperative in the Western Amazon, where we reduced the waste rates of nuts from 40% to 5%. We tripled the price paid to producers in about 3 years, which caused a doubling of the price paid to everybody else. And we actually created about 300 jobs in a local community. The jobs and the increased income allowed that community to take over the municipality, and the municipality to take over the politics of the state, and pretty much run that state in Western Brazil for 25 years, creating a lot of jobs and having the best policies for conservation in the region. But what I really wanted to do was to figure out not just how to collect Brazil nuts, but how to stop the encroachment on the forest from cattle ranchers and soy. And that's when I came to WWF and basically started advising them on the key issues and trends that they were going to need to address going forward in the conservation mission. The saying we have in Northwest Missouri, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I think what we found was that we needed to really start looking at what are the issues coming that conservationists need to begin to study. And what I was doing for WWF was really making the case that food production is actually the biggest threat of all human uses of resources to our conservation mission. It's responsible for about 70% of biodiversity loss, about 70% of freshwater use by people, Something like 35% of marine stocks are overexploited, and a full 90% are exploited at or beyond sustainable offtake levels. 50% of topsoil has been lost in the last 150 years. About 25% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food production, and food production uses more chemicals than any other human activity on the planet. We currently use about 40% of all the land on the planet. And when you take out deserts and lakes and mountains and rivers and streams and cities and highways and the permafrost areas, there's not a whole lot left. So we can't just keep expanding food production. We've got to figure out how to use the land more sustainably, producing more with less. Today, what has happened as a result of humans and the rise of agriculture and livestock is that the Earth's mammals are now dominated by humans, pets and livestock, and wild mammals all combined represent less than 3% of biomass of mammals on the planet. Elephants, as you can see on the bottom, represent just one little dot. So we have a lot of pressure coming from land use and coming from livestock. And in the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. So we're going to have even more pressure as we have more people, more income, and more consumption. We've got to figure out, again, how to produce more with less, because the impacts that are acceptable with 7.5 billion people are not going to be with 10 billion people. Put another way, what is sustainable today won't be sustainable tomorrow and will be what we're trying to get rid of the year after that. So we've got to be constantly focusing on getting better, continuous improvement, a journey, not a destination. We've got to freeze the footprint of food, freeze how much land it takes, how much water it takes, etc., what the impacts of food are. In fact, we probably need to shrink them, but at the very least, we need to make sure they don't get any larger. So when we were starting out to work on food about 20 years ago, a little more than that, I went to the people who ran our conservation priority place programs and asked them what the biggest threats to their regions were. And between terrestrial and ocean, those are green and blue in this map, they said to a person that the biggest threats were different aspects of food production, whether it was wild caught fish, aquaculture, whether it was livestock, agriculture, or even the pulp and paper that was used for packaging. So with that in mind, then we identified the biggest threats in the food industry, and it was these 15 commodities. What we found when we started doing research on this is that we knew that there are 7.5 billion consumers, and that's a pretty daunting task to influence that many people. 1.5 billion producers that speak probably 6,000 languages is not any less daunting. But the place where it becomes a little bit more doable is that 300 to 500 companies control 70% of the trade of each of those 15 commodities. We started then lining up who are the companies that buy those, who's big to beef, who's big to pulp and paper, etc. And what we began to see is Cargill's here, Cargill's there, Cargill's everywhere. And there are a few other companies that pop up. And so then we took another crack at this, and what we found is that about 100 companies actually touch 25% of all 15 commodities. And that 25% will create competition from between 40 and 50% of production to sell into those markets because they pay more. So that was our strategy then. 100 companies we can move. We can actually work with that few companies. And so we started working on them and how they could manage their supply chains to encourage more sustainable production. Well, the first thing that we began to notice was that, gosh, China is big in all of these. They're either 1, 2, or 3 in production or consumption of most of them. and India is not far behind. And so it became very clear that a strategy that just focused on the US and Europe wasn't going to move the rest of the world. To give an example, in 2000, the US and Europe represented about 20 to 23% of global palm oil consumption, but by 2020, that has the percentage of palm oil going to those two regions has been reduced to about 11 or 12%. That's not enough to shift a marketplace. And we're also finding that Chinese companies are actually willing to outbid companies like Costco and others because they have a larger middle class, a larger group of wealthy people that are willing to pay more for many of the products. So we took a step back and we decided the issue isn't what to think, it's how to think, and maybe what to think about. And so we had to figure out new ways to begin to work on our issue. We knew that by 2050, we need to double net food availability. That was a given, because when it comes to feeding a child or cutting the tree is going to lose every time. So we've got to understand how to produce enough food and make it available, or we won't be able to maintain our conservation mission. We developed strategies around 4 different activities. One was around increasing productivity. One was around efficiency. One was around waste, and another was around consumption. I just want to walk through those quickly. So we asked the question, on a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about more sustainable products? Or should all choices be more sustainable? And it was our decision that we were going to, whatever people wanted to eat, we were going to help make it more sustainable, because changing what they ate was going to be a much harder course of action. We found that people waste about 1 out of 3 calories. In developing countries, it's more before the food leaves the farm. In developed countries, it's more in the downstream supply chains. But either way you cut it, it's about 1 out of 3 calories. So what can we do to begin to reduce waste? And we've started programs in that. And then there's genetics. As they used to say in Missouri, dance with the one that brung you. We got to the point we are in food production with plant breeding, etc., through genetics. We didn't always call it that, but that's what it effectively was, by saving seeds that were from more productive plants or had better flavors or other traits that we were looking for. But I think we need to maybe rethink the genetics work. We spend far too much of our money on plant breeding and research on corn, when bananas produce 20 times as many calories and sugar produces 60 times as many calories. So if we have to produce more food in the future, can we take sugar, which is so productive, and figure out how to add proteins and minerals and vitamins to the sugar plant rather than just change corn, or do the same with bananas? We need to think differently about how we increase productivity of nutritional foods. We also have to really understand where the world is headed. At about 2010, 2012, aquaculture for the first time surpassed beef as the total, by weight, as the total source of animal protein. Aquaculture actually has also surpassed wild-caught fish as the total as a source of seafood. What are we doing to make aquaculture more productive, more efficient, less impactful? It's where the future is. So what are we doing about that? At one point, we had the largest program on aquaculture starting about 25 years ago of any NGO in the world, and helped develop standards for different aquaculture species, because we saw this issue coming ahead of time. Agriculture takes about 70% of all the water used by people, and it takes about 1 liter of water to produce 1 calorie. You know, these are estimates. The numbers vary a little bit, but in the future, we're going to have to try to figure out how to use half a liter of water to produce 2 calories. That's kind of the ballpark we need to be in to actually produce more with less and maybe actually save a little bit more for nature. So the question that comes to mind is, which strategy is going to give us more food? Do we focus on standards and certification and working with the better producers, or do we focus on moving the bottom? And we spent a good decade or two working on voluntary standards for food. But I think what we have come to see more recently is that the bottom 25% of producers in terms of efficiency produce about 50% of all the impacts, but only about 10% of the product. So if we want to increase total production and reduce environmental impacts, we focus on the bottom, not the top. In the 21st century, sustainability is going to be pre-competitive. It's not going to be about a label on a product on a shelf with your name on it. It's going to be about companies working together, both within sectors and also along supply chains, to solve common problems. No company is big enough to solve sustainability issues on its own, and all companies buy product from the same producers on any given day. So it's important that we find ways to move the performance curves together so that everybody benefits from this. And we've begun to explore a lot of different ways that we can work with companies in pre-competitive spaces. One is through platforms. So we started working in 2010 with the Consumer Goods Forum to create a deforestation and conversion-free program for their supply chains. In that particular platform, there were 57 companies that committed to deforestation and conversion-free. In 2016, we added 168 companies in another platform in Europe committed to deforestation conversion-free from Brazil's Cerrado. So to extend a moratorium that had been created in the Amazon around soy, now to move that to the Cerrado as well, a neighboring savanna and forest region with both. In 2020, we launched a platform with a sustainable agriculture initiative called the SCI platform, with 28 EU dairy companies committing to deforestation and conversion-free feed. Soy from Brazil is a key component of the feed they use, and dairy in Europe represents about 18% of all soy imports. So getting these companies to move away from soy that couldn't be guaranteed to be deforestation-free was a way to actually help send a signal to the traders and the feed companies that the dairy companies wanted to get out of deforestation. The Global Salmon Initiative in 2021, just in January, made a commitment that all salmon producers would request that the feed that they use have no deforestation associated with the soy that is used as an ingredient in that feed as well. Another platform that we've been engaged with is the Seafood Task Force. In 2015, The Guardian wrote an expose of slave labor in the Thai fisheries. Because these fish are used to make fish meal and fish oil, they're in aquaculture feed and then subsequently in shrimp exports to the US. At that point, Thailand was the largest exporter of shrimp. In fact, 1 in 8 shrimp in the US at that point was actually produced with slave labor. We convinced the buyers, which included Costco and Walmart and Tesco in Europe, bankers like Citigroup, traders and feed manufacturers like CPF in Thailand, to stay and fix the problem, which they did, but they put a 6-month period where the feed companies actually had to produce traceable, credible feed that included no slave labor. So they had one mill up and running in 6 months, and within 2 years had 3 more. So that's an example of the type of work that we have been able to do through platforms. We also work with sectors, companies that are all involved in corn or soy or beef or leather or other things. One of them is the Global Salmon Initiative. In 2013, 50% of the production, or the companies that represented 50% of production, those CEOs committed that all their sales would be certified by 2020. They missed it, but they actually did get about 60% of their sales by 2020 and 45% of all global salmon aquaculture sales by 2020. And they reduced fish oil use by 9%, fish meal use by 17%, and treatments for sea lice by about 90%, finding other alternatives. But the biggest thing they did was reduce the amount of feed they used from a conversion factors of taking 3.5 kilos of feed to make 1 kilo of salmon to 1.2. And that had huge impacts on how much fish meal and fish oil they were using, how much soy they were using, etc. We've also worked a lot with countries, and one of the countries that we've been following and advising is Ireland. After the horse meat scandal in Europe, Ireland took a step back and said, we have got to regain the trust of our customers. And so they set up a group called Board BIA, and they created a program, Origin Green, that actually collected information from all people that export food from Ireland, not just beef, but all food. And over the next 10 years, in fact, they're just at 9 years right now, but they've now signed up about 60,000 beef and dairy producers that have put their data into this system to show how they're performing against key environmental indicators. And when they put their information in, they get information about how others are doing so that they can see if they're below or above average. If they're below average, they can see what others have done to improve their performance. And this has put more trust in the Irish Food Board. We're just waiting now for their 10-year results because we're not aware of any other country that has actually worked with producers to improve exports. So that gets us closer to today, where we have about 7.5 billion food experts. Everybody eats every day, probably more than once a day, and they are all experts if you just ask them. Social media trumps science. Extremes dominate most discussions, and certainly food discussions as well. We know now that we need to know not just where food was produced, but also how it was produced. And that's causing another set of realities in terms of traceability and supply chains. And we're doing this in the context of a growing distrust in trade, globalization, and experts. And I say a growing distrust in trade, which is interesting because I wrote a book on global commodity trade of agricultural commodities and what the impacts of producing those commodities were in 2004. And at that point, only 6% of food was being traded across borders. Today, it's about 24%. So the amount of trade in food has gone up tremendously, even as people trust it less. Food is cheap, but about 800 million can't afford it. That's another reality today. And half of farm families can't feed themselves. It's interesting to note that 75% of global poverty, 75% of malnourishment and other measures of lack of nutrition, such as stunting, are in farm families and the people they employ. So that's a stark contrast or condemnation, really, of a system that we have today. So we can't totally divorce our environmental agenda from the fact that these supply chains and these systems aren't actually allowing the producers to create a better life for themselves or for their children. I think one of the things that as an organization we've come to realize is that innovation is critical, but it's not just innovation of what others do, it's also innovation of what we do at WWF. The speed of change is much faster today than our response. We identify an issue and it's 30 years or more. Remember, I was doing Rainforest Crunch as a way to stop deforestation in 1990. So that's 30 years ago, and we're still working with deforestation now. We knew about deforestation 10 or 20 years before that. So we need to figure out how to speed up and how to be more effective at our programs. We need to rethink the role of NGOs in the 21st century. We're winning battles and losing wars, and we need to shift from doing to influencing. I like to say we need to begin to think more laterally, identify what's coming, not what's here, focus on issues, trends, and tools as a way to get a head start on these things. Most of the pictures are already in front of us if we just learn how to see them. So for example, I like to say it's like having a kaleidoscope. All the pieces are inside it. If you turn it one notch, you see a totally different picture. That's what we need to begin to do. That's the how to think part. So if we can identify issues and trends and build awareness and consensus, strategic focus, document proof of concept, then we can begin to accelerate far more meaningful results. That's the goal of the Markets Institute that we've created at WFUS. And it's really about a change of theory for influence. These ideas and issues and trends percolate through a pipeline, some of which stay inside WWF, but many of which are hived off and go into businesses individually or in platforms, are taken up by governments, etc. As we try to influence more, the two institutions that are the most important for us to focus on are governments and the private sector. 5,000 more projects run by an NGO is not going to save the planet. We need to get the biggest institutions engaged in the work that we think is the most important. And we do that by making them aware of it, by letting them help solve the problem. We've created a thought leader group. There's about 20 of us that get together in person once a year and at other times. And we identify each year 5 issues, 5 trends, and 5 tools that we need to be aware of. We publish this information as well. A lot of what we look at are business models. Are the business models we're currently using fit for purpose, or should we change them? A lot of companies try to do better internally, and I think Unilever is one of those. I did a case study of Unilever at one point, almost 20 years ago now, where 95% of Indonesians buy a Unilever product every week. About 3,000 Indonesians actually work for Unilever, but because of the way they've redesigned their products, they're buying more and more raw materials inside Indonesia. So 100,000 full-time producers create or grow raw materials for Unilever. And in addition, about 200,000 people sell Unilever products to other Indonesians. They're creating a strategy aimed at the bottom of the pyramid that creates jobs, both for the people who produce raw materials as well as for the ones that sell their products. And they pay more in taxes each year than they make in profits. Other companies are beginning to look at how to bring value back into value chains through employee stock option plans, joint ventures, and other things. The issue is, how can we bring externalities into pricing? In Brazil, producers have set up juice processing plants where they own a quarter of the plant. The workers in the plant own a quarter of the plant. The major buyer of that, a French company, owns a quarter of the plant, and a group of investors own the other quarter of the plant. The producers don't manage the plant, but they have a strong equity holder position. So if the plant makes money, they make money as well. We've done the same thing with Calvert, create an investment fund to set up worker partially owned or producer partially owned manufacturing and processing facilities. And Costco has just set up a poultry operation that produces about 400 million birds a year in Nebraska, where they have long-term contracts with the people growing the products. They have long-term contracts with the people producing the products. These are ways to change the basic formula of how these companies are run. We also look at what's the new farming techniques that are coming. And even if they're not quite ready for play today, like vertical agriculture, where it still uses about 30% more energy than other forms of producing leafy greens and other crops that can be grown undercover, it uses 90% less water. So we think it's one of those technologies that's probably on its way to becoming more efficient, and like wind or solar will become more efficient in the next 10 to 20 years. But in the meantime, we think we can pilot a system in St. Louis to look at a hybrid business strategy for vertical ag. We want to use stranded assets like thermal power plants for the hot water and heat, and that can be used all winter long to help reduce some of the cost of these vertical ag situations. We want to document how that happens. We want to use long-term contracts with local retailers so that those can be turned into used as assets to borrow money and help get these types of projects started. And we really want to produce both food and jobs in the middle of urban areas, in food deserts, and document the multiplier effect of having better, fresher food in terms of the impact on restaurants, et cetera. And finally, we brought in of the largest vertical ag company in the US to be a co-partner, and they've specifically set aside up to 40% of the equity of this to be owned by the community, either a community development fund or another vehicle, so that it has a different business structure. From the community's point of view, this is a great option, but from the company's point of view, this lets them go to another city faster because they don't have to wait so long to recover their payment, their investment in this particular project. We've just been working during the COVID to see if there's a way that we can take the post office, which is really a stranded asset, and use it to reduce food waste by helping farmers find markets. The post office delivers to every house in the country. Why can't they bring food into food deserts? So we're talking with USPS and USDA to see how this might happen. They've got a few other problems right now, but this could be a major source of income, and it could all be done within a single zone so that food could be delivered within 24 hours. We've done a pilot which shows that it looks like it could actually work. But we do need to think about efficiency and efficiency and efficiency. So this shows the traditional areas that poultry producers managed in the past. They looked at and monitored how much feed it took to make a bird of a certain weight. And over a period of 100+ years, they feel they'll get it down to about a third of the feed that's being used. They've reduced the mortality rate. They've reduced the time to market, and they've increased the weight at the time the bird is marketed. They're going to have to do all this and more, and the and more is not just better on these issues, but also on animal welfare, on how much water, on antibiotics, and maybe even on where the feed is grown and what impacts that feed itself had on the environment, which now have to be incorporated into the impacts of poultry. But in short, they're going to need to shift from maximizing one variable to optimizing key ones. I mentioned earlier that the real impact of producing food is not the best producers, it's the worst producers. So we came up with a concept in the Institute about 5 or 6 years ago called Codex Planetarius. And it is kind of a takeoff of Codex Alimentarius, which is a global health and safety system that produces minimal standards that every globally traded food item has to meet from a health and safety and phytosanitary perspective. The goal is to do the same thing with regard to environmental impacts. So it's not human health we're looking at, it's planetary health. And we want to use trade to actually help establish a floor for the bottom, encourage countries to step up and make this happen. The UK government is voting on this right now in Parliament to adopt this as the first country. They're taking it to the Congress of the Party discussion on climate change. They're also taking it to the CBD, the meeting that focuses on biodiversity globally. They're introducing it into the WTO. And so we think that this is a great way to kind of, in addition to finding what the better practices are, also figuring out how to move the bottom, but making sure that we're measuring it the same way so that there is an escalator to help get the poorer performers to be much better. And then there's climate change and the impact of climate change on food production. We're seeing that many crops, we don't produce oats in the US anymore. They're produced in Canada because it's too hot. Corn is moving out of the country as well into Canada. In the meantime, a lot of land is being plowed up that used to be grassland. Now for crops, it's moving more towards the north and west into this area of Canada. Historically, this was exactly the area where we had the Dust Bowl after it was plowed up for planting into crops. And this is what it looks like we're headed towards again, especially if we get, as has been predicted, the 2030s whole decade is supposed to be drier in the US. If that's the case, this could easily turn into another Dust Bowl area. We're focusing on issues on the horizon in the Markets Institute. We've done a lot of work on illegality. We've found illegality common in species trade, in minerals, in fish, in forest, in agriculture. We've also found it common in every step along the value chain, from primary production to aggregation to processing to manufacturing, shipping, retail, and even at home. In fact, the studies show that about 50% of food produced in the US is not produced legally because the labor is about 50% is illegal. We're also working to establish the African Orphan Crops Collaborative, which has identified the 100 most important food crops in Africa and help increase, to map the genomes of these crops in order to produce more nutrients for Africans. The goal here is to produce more of the foods that Africans already eat and know how to produce in the places in the world like Africa where population and income and consumption are going to increase the most in the next 30 years. And then there is California. California has only been the breadbasket or the food basket, if you will, of the US for the last 90 or 100 years. Before that, it wasn't. It was too far away. We didn't have refrigerated shipping, etc. With climate change, we're seeing California become less desirable. It's still going to produce products, but the question is, where is the next California going to be? And so we've been looking at that question and looking at different places where that might be. But the important thing is that every country in the world has a California, and nobody has actually asked this question yet and is starting to work on it. We know that if we want smooth transitions, we need to identify things well ahead of time and get working on them. If you're interested in what we're thinking about and how we think about it, we publish a markets newsletter once a week. It's about 850 words of our opinions on an issue that's important, as well as how to interpret 5 or 6 other pieces of news that we report on, and we provide a kind of subtext to what the text is. Think about it. Thank you very much. And sorry, may have felt a little bit like drinking from a fire hose.
Oh, no, not at all, Jason. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. We've got a lot of good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about how you're addressing inequity in food distribution.
Well, I think the biggest thing that has come to light in the past year with COVID is that globally it's not just about Black Lives Matter, but also of diversity and inclusion much more broadly. And what we're seeing is that the most inequitable institution on the planet probably are global supply chains. To give you an example, when coffee growers sell coffee, what they receive is a tiny percentage of what you're actually paying for that cup of coffee. But what they're receiving isn't even the same. So Brazil, because it's fairly well organized, it's been producing coffee for a long time. The producers of Brazilian coffee get about 90% of the export price of coffee. But in Central America and Colombia, they only get about 60%. And in West Africa, they only get about 40%. And it's these kinds of situations where consumers end up paying more and more, but producers often end up getting less and less. And that is the kind of inequity that's not going to work. We're concerned because we look at a place like West Africa that produces most of the world's cocoa. We see that in Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, an average farmer makes about 62 cents a day, and they're supposed to be paying workers a livable wage. We think the fact that they make so little money on their cocoa is one of the reasons that child labor, and now we're seeing even indentured service and bonded labor in West Africa. These are issues that we need to figure out how to get to the bottom of it. So we've been working with companies to look at what the price is that actually gets to the producer. Are there ways that they can have long-term contracts that allow producers to use that contract as an asset to borrow money and invest in more sustainable production and in more sustainable processing that gives them some of the value added downstream? We have to look at this a lot of different ways. There's no one size fits all, but it's an issue that's very important to address. This isn't, as you know, the front and center issue of a group like WWF, but that means we have to bring in partners who can help us address this.
Mm-hmm. So someone was curious about, earlier you were talking about adding proteins to sugars. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means exactly and what the sources of sugars are?
So the sources of sugar in that particular slide were sugar from sugarcane. Sugarcane is just an incredibly productive plant. The question is, how can we use that vigor and that growth to produce something that is a better nutrient for people to be eating? Is there any way we can do that? What could we find if we actually began to invest a small portion of the amount of money that we're investing in corn or soybeans or other crops in making that transition? With marker-assisted breeding, we can actually splice in traits, or we can find traits in wild cultivar, relatives of sugarcane we can begin to figure out ways to produce a more nutritious product from that. And maybe it's not sugarcane, maybe it's bananas. But my point with that is that we're focusing most of our research dollars on temperate crops, whereas some of the most productive crops are in the tropics where they grow year round, and where we can produce much more from plants that have never really been subjected to plant breeding. That's one of the reasons we took on the African Orphan Crops Collaborative, because we mapped the genomes of 100 different crops so that modern plant breeding techniques could be used to increase productivity. None of the crops that are traditional household or even local market crops have ever benefited from modern plant breeding. So we need to begin to think about that. I mean, it could be GMO, but it doesn't have to be. It could be gene editing, and gene editing could be GMO, or it doesn't have to be. I think people can agree or disagree about the values of either of those traits, but we have got to be doing more with genetics to increase overall productivity if we're going to meet the demands of more people that have more money and that are buying up the food chain, particularly buying more into animal proteins and vegetable oils, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you were talking about deforestation and conversion free. Can you define what conversion free is?
So we have had a long focus on deforestation, and we came to realize, I think maybe principally through our program in the Northern Great Plains, that, hey, it's not just forests that are being cut down, it's also grasslands that are being plowed under. And these are grasslands that, withstood the plow even during the march west across the Great Plains. So we added and conversion, because we're talking about the conversion of any natural habitat. You lose biodiversity. You also volatilize a lot of carbon that's been stored in the soil in those areas. It's the same with wetlands. If you drain wetlands, that's a kind of conversion of natural habitat to something you can use to farm. But I think the place that's the most significant and maybe the most surprising, well, I won't say most significant, because everybody's natural habitat that they like is the most significant for them, but the one that is the most unknown, perhaps, is permafrost. So last year, for the first time ever, Russia planted and harvested wheat, corn, and soybeans in an area that had previously been permafrost, but because of climate change was now farmable. What we know from the science is that the methane and other CO2 equivalents that are stored within the permafrost, all the scientists who made the initial calculations about human-related CO2 emissions had not counted on the permafrost as being a source of new emissions, because they thought it was going to bond with the iron that's in the soil, and in fact it doesn't. And so now it's being volatilized. If you farm that land, how fast the emissions occur is much faster. And so we know that melting of the permafrost is going to cause a lot more CO2 equivalent emissions. Can we at least not farm it so that we can have that happen over 30 or 40 or 50 years rather than 10 or 20? It's going to be really critical to postpone as many of these things as we can. And just this week, there was another conversion issue, if you will. There was a research study that showed that bottom trawling for things like tropical shrimp and flounder and halibut and sometimes even clams and oysters and scallops causes more greenhouse gas emissions, or as much greenhouse gas emissions as all air travel and jet emissions. And that's never been calculated before either. So that suddenly makes aquaculture look a little bit more interesting, if it didn't already.
Mm-hmm. So in regards to seafood, when people are at the store looking to buy it, what should they keep an eye out for on the labels? Is farm raised better than wild caught? Are there certain icons on the labels they should be looking for?
I think that we give preference to the MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, and the ASC, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, because we think both of them are robust. They're not perfect, and we're sure that they can be improved, but they're the best in class today for wild caught and for aquaculture. So that's our preference. Aside from that, we would be looking for programs that are in fisheries improvement projects, where we're beginning to manage the monitor and manage fisheries better so that we can judge the offtake. There's a lot of things that can be done in that regard. It is, I think, an issue when you go into a store and there's simply nothing on the label to tell you anything. And in that regard, it's probably better to eat down the trophic levels. So you don't want to eat the high-end carnivores. It would be better if you ate down others. Develop a taste for calamari, develop a taste for shellfish, develop a taste for tilapia, even catfish, etc. It's not going to probably be what you buy all the time, but boy, if you start substituting some of those things, it will make a difference.
Mm-hmm. That's great to know. So earlier you had a chicken chart up, and someone was wondering, how is the amount of feed for a chicken reduced, and at the same time, amount of meat produced is increased?
You know, it's interesting. It seems kind of almost like magic. One of the key issues, though, is that feed is dry weight and chickens are wet weight. So that's a big thing. If you soaked feed, it would have a lot more weight than it does, but that's the way the calculation is made. Now, those particular criteria that I mentioned are also mutually reinforcing. If you have a higher mortality rate, all the feed that was eaten by the chickens that die affects the average of all the rest of the chickens. So lowering your mortality rate actually affects your feed conversion rate.
All right.
Does that make
That
sense?
makes
So all of
absolutely,
these
yeah.
become mutually reinforcing. And that's what good indicators do, is they tend to reinforce each other. Now, that doesn't work, unfortunately, for animal welfare, or other kinds of things, or how much water was used. But we have set standards for both poultry and pork for those industries in Brazil, and within a year of setting a standard around water for poultry in Brazil, they had reduced water consumption by 50% just because they started measuring it and managing it. They didn't waste water anymore.
Okay, someone just really quickly would like you to repeat again what people should look for on the labels of their seafood.
Well, the first choice we would have would be either MSC for wild caught seafood or ASC for seafood that is produced by aquaculture. Then I think if there's any mention of being part of fisheries improvement project, that's another tick, because it means they're in the process of making that particular fishery more sustainable. You want to, I think now with all the data about bottom trawling, you might want to kind of avoid bottom trawling, because it's not just about the fish sustainability, it's also about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that particular fish or that particular shrimp. So to answer your question, I think from an environmental point of view, aquaculture shrimp would be better than wild caught shrimp.
All right, and so one final question today, because we're getting close to the top of the hour. There are a few people who just wanted to know more about any efforts that are being made to avert another Dust Bowl.
Well, I think, I first started using that juxtaposition of maps about 4 or 5 years ago, and it really sobered people up. I mean, I'm old enough to have grown up with parents who lived in the Dust Bowl in Northwest Missouri, and they would have to sweep their houses because of the dust that was coming in from Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado. And so for me, it was something that I grew up with. Every year at school, we made conservation posters about how to improve soil health, how to do this. Well, the way to avoid it is to get roots in the ground fast. So replant those areas, ideally, with native grasses, but if not, any kind of grass, to get roots in the ground before it starts getting hotter. But use things that have tolerance for drought, because with climate change, we're going to have a lot more weather variability, and a lot of the deep-rooted plants are going to have a much better chance of surviving.
Great. Okay, well, Jason, this has been so incredibly interesting. I really do appreciate you spending time with us today. I'm going to call it there with questions, and I just do want to remind everyone who's watching, Jason is more than happy to answer any further questions you may have. You can see his email and all of his other social media contact information on the screen there, and I will also include it in the follow-up email, as well as the website for the Markets Institute, so you can take a peek at that and also sign up for the newsletter there. All right, Jason, I'm going to hand it back over to you for any closing comments you'd like to make.
Well, I know that when you start hearing this litany of issues and problems, and you also start hearing all the different ways that we're trying to help solve these problems, that it becomes very daunting to somebody. But you really can make a difference yourself. Just be more thoughtful about what you buy. Be more thoughtful about what you throw away. Don't waste food. It's a precious resource that is full of other precious resources like soil and water and nutrients. We all are going to have to do better. We don't think that there is a single diet that everybody should adopt. We don't think that there's a single strategy that everybody should adopt, but everybody can do something. And so you need to decide what you can do. And again, I would just say, think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jason. And I'd like to thank everyone else who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and I'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks again, Jason.
Thank you.